Almost 22 months of war, images of hunger in the Gaza Strip bring many supporters and friends of Israel to say enough is enough. In the meantime, Netanyahu's ministers focus on anything but ending the war. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedman in London. Unholy, two Jews on the news. We have talked for so long about when the world's patience almost might run out. It felt to me and feels to me as if we've come to that kind of moment, really. Always you have to make a distinction when you're talking about the world. It's felt, I think, most obviously in the West, outside the United States. We're going to get on to the subject, particularly of the United States, with our guest. Tom Friedman of the New York Times is going to join us later. We'll talk specifically about the US. But outside, there was a letter from 28 countries, including Australia, the UK, and many, many European countries, voicing, I think, what is a feeling among a whole lot of people who are friends of Israel, which is just a kind of horror at the images, but also the substance, the reality of hunger in Gaza. And there'd been warnings of it, there'd been intimations of it, but it's reached a point, I think, this week where people can't really, unless they have a real reason to, can't be denied. And I think what has captured it, as so often, are pictures. And there are just photographs strikingly on the front page of a really pro-Israel, right-leaning newspaper, the Daily Express in this country, of a starving baby. Skeletal pictures of children now wherever you turn. Any website, you open it up, there are pictures of bone-thin children. And it taps a very deep human nerve, I think, which is whatever the arguments you have about wars and bombing, nobody, I think, can make any kind of defense, even actually internally against themselves, about seeing a starving child. We are hardwired to react with intense emotion at that. And then when that hunger isn't like the hunger of 40 years ago in Ethiopia, the big famine that led to Live Aid, which recently marked its anniversary, but which is, in the words of the head of the World Health Organization, man-made, avoidable. And the humans who are making this situation, who could avoid it, I'm afraid, are the people in charge in Israel who could just decide to put aside all the arguments and let food in. And so people who are friends of Israel, who have paid a big political price, by the way, these last 2 years, a lot of these government leaders have paid a price because they haven't joined the crowds demanding condemnation of Israel. They are now saying, we can't do anything with this. We can't, our peoples will not accept the image of starving children and the reality of starving children. And there is a Jewish aspect to this, I'm bound to say, where it hits a very deep Jewish nerve because of our history to see pictures of people with their ribs showing, starving, children dying in their parents' arms. There's a letter going from a group of rabbis, I think internationally, that says the severe limitation placed on humanitarian relief in Gaza, the policy of withholding food, water and medical supplies from a needy civilian population contradict all the core values of Judaism as we understand it. We cannot keep silent in the name of the core Torah values that every person is created in God's image. This is the pitch we've reached, and I think it's just a moment of despair, horror and revulsion. And as I say, it's felt by people who would regard themselves historically as friends of Israel.
You put the blame, all of it, on the Israeli government and said that they should let food in. I think it's important, even if we agree on the fact that this shouldn't be happening, to say what is going on in that sense. And perhaps it's easier for me for a moment to escape into the technicalities of it. But I think the technicalities are important because that is how to solve the situation. Two things need to happen urgently. One is to flood Gaza with food, a decision that indeed hasn't been made by the Israeli government. What has been made is that there is food coming in, but the problem, of course, is the fact that the lines of supply have crashed. So if you're in Dir el-Balach, it's going to be very problematic for you to have food. In other places, it might be easier. The other thing that needs to happen is that the roads leading or the roads in which the convoys are passing need to be secure. Again, I think it's easy to go to the technicalities, but it isn't accurate to say, and not that I'm defending the Israeli government, that Israel is not letting food in. I don't think that is right now the problem. And I think that defining accurately what the problem is will help solve it, and it needs to be solved urgently. And as I said, it's chaos, it's gang war, it's war. All of these things complicate everything. Hamas began this. All of this is true. What is also true is that we cannot be in a situation in which there is hunger in Gaza. And I think that it's important for listeners to know that there has been a lot of criticism, and we're not going to go deep into that, about how Israeli media did or didn't cover Gaza. I think it's important to say that these things are an evolution, and in the same way that it took months for Israeli anchors to wear a hostage pin, not because we don't have solidarity with the hostages, but because we really didn't know what to do in this situation before. It took a long time to focus our attention on what is happening in Gaza. And it's very clear for anyone who saw the news this week that Israelis, are receiving that information very clearly. Again, might seem like something so obvious, but it's not really.
Your point about the media, absolutely well taken. I think the technicality point that you made, when you say the supply routes collapsed, that didn't just happen out of the sky. That was a decision by the Israeli government, which was, we won't work with the UN and its various agencies who have years of experience with this, who have worked out how to get aid to this population. We saw it in that period of the ceasefire between January and March. Food came in. We weren't seeing these images on TV. They had a method. Israel decided that the UN was hopelessly compromised, that was too biased against Israel, and it would set up something else.
It decided that everything that the UN brought in was looted by Hamas. So
right, but they decided that the system was not working, they said. And so they went for this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose record has been chaotic and bloody. There's arguments about the numbers, but it seems they estimated, I think the UN estimates it's around 1,000 killed at various food distribution points. People will argue about the numbers. Hundreds, I think it's clear, have been killed. And the UN system is crying out saying, we can deal with this problem. We can get food to those people. Now, I know the counter-argument is, but that will strengthen the hand of Hamas because they can loot it and that gives them leverage. I have said on the podcast before, and I still feel, I don't care if that happens. I actually don't care, because that is better than the alternative, which is a dying baby in its mother's arms. That is, to me, so unconscionable that you take the hit on an improvement in leverage for Hamas on the ground. But there is another way of doing it. I mean, there's a proposal, and I wish I could give credit to the person who thought of this because I think it's brilliant, which is flood the zone to such an extent, send so much food aid in, 50 times what the people of Gaza need, and then suddenly the black market value of that food will plummet. And that won't give Hamas leverage if there's enough food there. That would be another way to solve this problem. If the Israeli policymakers' problem was, we don't want food to be a useful asset for Hamas, fine. Devalue it by flooding the zone with it. The starting point should have been, whatever else happens, we cannot use starvation as a method of war. We cannot have children dying. We cannot have doctors in hospital emergency rooms fainting because they haven't eaten. We cannot have a statement from the BBC, AFP, AP and Reuters jointly saying that they cannot, they are deeply concerned for their own journalists on the ground because their journalists are starving. I mean, AFP put out a statement saying that in all the decades they've been in business, they've had journalists dying in war and bombings and shootings. They've never had this before when their own journalists are starving. All of those should have been red lines for Israel, and there should have been an ingenious solution which says, okay, those are red lines, so how do we achieve our objective without them? And I think this flooding the zone idea would have been a brilliant solution. But whatever the way round it, the technicalities should be secondary to a straightforward, clear, in my view, moral position, which is there are certain things you do not do and cannot do, by the way, banned under international law, and those include the starvation of a civilian population, including children. This is what the world has now seen. It is what it is now associating with Israel. It is why those rabbis warn that this will be this is a crisis for Judaism, they write, and for the good name of in the Jewish people. Of course it is, because this won't be forgotten. This is playing out on people's screens all over the world. Yes, of course, in the 21st century, there have been bigger calamities and crimes. You think of obviously what Bashar Assad was doing in Syria to his own population. You think of the many killed in the Iraq War in 2003. But this is in people's phones, on people's TV every day. It is being seared into their minds and consciousness and imagination, and will not be forgotten. You know, we've had people on the podcast saying Gaza is the issue for this generation, younger people. And they are being fawned by what they're seeing, which is images of starvation, which were not caused by a drought or some act of God, but they were caused by a series of decisions, which, you know, and I understand the background of those decisions. You know, just one snapshot, a UK opinion poll this week, only 18% now support Israel's actions in Gaza. 55% of them oppose them, and 81% of those 55% say it's genocide. But when you have a British population coming to a view that used to be confined to the far left, this is because of what people are seeing and the horror of it. I'm just trying to flag where we are now at in terms of how Israel is seen. A terrible Rubicon has been crossed, and every day that goes by without a flood of aid going in is going to make that a Rubicon that cannot be uncrossed. You know, we have reached this moment.
As I said before, a decision needs to be made to flood the zone. A decision like this has been made, and a few times during the war, this decision has been made. I don't know if the Israeli government is close to that decision. I think it is, just because of the pressure being put, and I hope it is. If I can say something about what it feels like here, because obviously the whole focus is on what is going on in Gaza. But the Israeli public is tired of this war as well, which is apparent in every single poll that's been coming out consistently, more than 70% of the population. And perhaps it's not, you know, something that people focus on. But this week I met a very young combat soldier, a female soldier, who was injured in a way that will affect her whole life. She's tough and resilient, but her life is never going to be the same. There are 12,500 Israeli soldiers injured, and that's just physical injuries. There is a very worrying rise in suicide among soldiers. The age of the soldiers is, of course, younger and younger, because they go into basic training and then go into the military. And anyone who knows the society knows what that means, and how many people in this country haven't been sleeping, to say nothing of 50 hostages, 20 of them at least alive, who are being tormented and starved in Gaza. So the public is exhausted, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they want the end of this war and the return of the hostages. And I think that the effect of seeing very clearly what is happening on the other side is also, you know, taking a toll on that public perception. So perhaps that's not the, you know, focus of, you know, the world this week, but it's definitely what we are discussing in between, you know, sirens from Houthis, who I'm still trying to figure out what we actually did to them and why they're actually shooting at us. But that feeling of a war within a war, a little bit like a Russian doll, is something that when we had Ilana Dayan last week, and she talked about the exhaustion and a lot of anger, of course, towards the government, that is part of the story. When the military goes for the first time into Deir el-Balach and the decision is to pressure Hamas, this is an area that the military didn't enter thus far because of the fear of hurting hostages. And if a minister in the government, Orit Struk, is saying, well, if that happens, then so be it, is something that for Israelis is, I think in a general sense, is very hard to deal with. When another minister says, Miri Regev, the Gaza war won't end and Israel shouldn't be afraid of occupation. Again, I think a lot of what we are talking about would perhaps be easier to digest, not relating to the hunger in Gaza, but to everything else, if Israel and Israelis and Israel's friends knew where this is heading and what is the end game, and if there is indeed an end game. So that is something that I think should be thrown in the mix as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we did talk about it with Ilana last week, about the exhaustion with it. And I think it goes to explain why there aren't the numbers, for example, on the streets of Israel demanding an end to this war now, tonight, that there were, for example, during the judicial coup, that the population has just been worn down by two. And in fact, if you think about the civil strife of 2023, maybe even 3 years of exhausting events, and that perhaps explains. But I was listening to a former British diplomat this week who was saying he thinks there are only two players who can bring an end to this. One is Donald Trump, and we'll talk about that with our guest, and the other is Israeli public opinion. If they, as it were, blow the whistle and say this enough, it will stop. And I question that assertion by the former diplomat on this ground, which is, I think from what you're telling me and from what the polling says, they are saying that. Israelis do want it over. I mean, I was quoting a poll from last week, 74%. I think there's one, puts the figure at 82%. People want it over. There is almost a kind of democratic crisis here because the people want this over and yet their leaders will not end it. And that makes you wonder about the kind of the democratic disconnect in Israel, that there can be this huge public sentiment and yet it is not manifested. Instead, you have this government where its ministers are speaking about expanding and going further. I mean, I saw Bezalel Smotrich saying that, if any end of the war will be a surrender, and if he detects any weakness, his word, in Netanyahu, he will be out of the government straight away. The clock is ticking for this recess. May it just start already. Because maybe then, when the Knesset is not sitting for reasons we've talked about before, the Prime Minister will feel able to end this horror show that is going on. But every hour it passes, it leads to a lasting impact. And that's the thing I stress, a lasting impact on the other side, because this population who have witnessed this and have grown up with it will not forgive lightly what they have gone through. And I think in terms of the rest of the world and their impression and view of Israel, every hour this passes, it's as if this government of Israel is taking an axe to the good name of Israel, and I would say, like those rabbis, the Jewish people. And it's going to be the work of generations to repair it.
Yeah, well, at first I would say it'd probably be the work of generations to repair the atrocities of October 7th. I would start there, but I would also say that where we are right now is that it is actually, it did seem for at least 24 or 48 hours that everyone in this story, all of the mediating countries were saying to Hamas, we're not even taking your answer back to Israel because you need to fix your response. And it's very clear, and there's nothing to do about that, right? But it's very clear that Hamas is seeing the international pressure, and it thinks that perhaps the world will press on Israel to end the war without having to give back any of the hostages. I think that Netanyahu would really want at this point to go to at least a partial deal. Obviously, the issues with ending the war completely, we know what that entails. But I don't know if we are in a situation in which Hamas, that feels rather powerful from everything that is going on, sadly, would go for all this. I'll just, make a brief note on history. I think it's important. It always is important, but we are fast approaching the 20-year mark on the disengagement from Gaza and the dismantlement of all settlements, and Israel withdrawing, indeed, from Gaza, and hoping, in the words of Ariel Sharon, was the architect of that this will be an experiment that will lead to, and could lead to, a Palestinian state. And sadly, we know that history worked out very, very differently. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about and to talk about when we look at that scope and the attempts that Israel did indeed make to change the trajectory and the trajectory of what happened.
And we will actually be talking about that in a bit more depth for our friends and family, subscribers to the podcast. We will do a bonus episode about the 20th anniversary of disengagement. I think it's really your point about the negotiations are really important, that there is clearly stuff going on behind the scenes. Hamas do indeed see worldwide outrage as leverage. I think it's one of the sort of strategic errors here is to walk into that trap. And I think that goes back to October the 7th, which is to know that you are dealing with such a horrific enemy, such an evil enemy, who regard the suffering of their own people as an asset for them. They want civilian death because they want to delegitimize Israel in the eyes. Therefore, my view would have been, don't hand them that weapon. Don't give them that leverage. That's why I think aid should have been taken off the table from the beginning. Because if you're dealing with an enemy who wants their population to suffer, don't do them that favor. So that's, that it has indeed become a bargaining chip. My view is it just shouldn't be a chip. It should not be admissible as one of the things that, well, if Hamas do this, then we'll let food in. No. Or we'll change the arrangements on food. Don't play that game is my view. But look, let's hope that there is indeed the pressure from those mediators. As you said, they didn't even hand the proposal on, that they are putting pressure on Hamas. And I hope that the government of Israel does realize that there are people in the world who matter besides just the American president. So when you're getting to 28 countries, including Australia, including EU, including Britain, do listen to those. There might come a day when you need friends other than just the Trump White House. All the eggs in that one basket. Yes, at the moment, Donald Trump appears to be saying, whatever you do is fine with me. But that might not be permanent. And there are other pressures that matter. And I think ultimately, it should be a matter of conscience, even if the rest of the world were not saying all of this. So all of that is predicated on the idea that, as I mentioned, when eventually he doesn't have Knesset pressure, Parliament in session, maybe the Prime Minister is going to feel some more room for manoeuvre. The date of the 28th, which is fast approaching, is sort of there or thereabouts. But there has been a whole lot of, political activity. Does any of it, as you read it, Yonit, point to some kind of movement?
I mean, I think the interesting thing to note is what happened this week in the Knesset, which is the fact that Netanyahu ousted Yuli Edelstein as the head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. That is the most important committee in the Knesset. And in other instances, like in the firing of Yoav Gallant, who was defense minister, and like with Netanyahu showing the door to Herzi Halevi, the head of the military, that was presented to the Israeli public in some sort of pretense, right? They're culpable because of October 7th and all kinds of things. It's not because of the draft bill. But in the case of Yuli Edelstein, it was very clear there wasn't even pretense. It was because of his refusal to pass the draft bill, the exemption for the ultra-Orthodox while the war is going on, that made this decision, that made Netanyahu move him aside. And it is really, I think if there's one thing that will, might crack this government, is the public sentiment against this bill, coming from many, many people who serve in the military and are reservists in the military, and even in Netanyahu's constituency, are really upset at this. But again, we are at the end of the summer session, as you mentioned. It's 3 months until this all picks up again in October. And by then, I think that we will all be discussing early elections, either in March or in April. There's no way that Netanyahu will pass another budget of cuts in an election year that was slated in any case to be an election year. So we are heading towards early elections. We always think about the fact that after October 7th, who would have imagined Netanyahu still being in power in 2025? But in any case, the elections will not, I would bet that, right, would not happen in October, at the end of October 2026, where they're slated today. Yeah,
and that will be a kind of moment of truth, a sentiment indeed voiced by our guest.
So 2026 is going to be a very important political year in Israel. It's also going to be a very important political year in the United States. And to talk about that connection and the relationship between the two countries, and also how Israel is viewed, I think, from the outside, to talk about that a little bit more, let's hear from our guest this week.
Tom Friedman is a multiple winner of the Pulitzer Prize, including for commentary, and has been a New York Times columnist since the 1990s. He made his name as a correspondent in Beirut and in Jerusalem, and has long been regarded as the single most influential writer on Israel and the Middle East in the American press, and is a friend of Unholy. Tom, welcome back to Unholy.
Great to be with my friends on Unholy.
And it's really good to have you with us. There's a very strong sense sitting here in London that a kind of line has been crossed, that of all the events of war, an avoidable famine is somehow in a different category. It's somehow kind of unconscionable for a democratic country to be doing that. It's very noticeable. We've been talking about it already on this podcast, that even right-wing pro-Israel newspapers are now saying enough of this and putting very, very graphic images on their front pages. I just wonder, your read of the United States, whether there is a similar sense of a line being crossed, a similar sense of outrage that you're picking up in the United States.
Johnny, there is, but it's much more confined, I would say. In Europe, it's being expressed from the top down. You have leaders across Europe and from the European Union expressing outrage over this and deep concern, and expressing that to Israel. We do not have that from the Trump administration. Every once in a while you read that Trump got mad enough or saw something that outraged him enough that maybe even got on the phone to Netanyahu. But at neither the congressional level nor the administration level do you have that kind of sustained reaction and sense of outrage. President right now is consumed with relitigating the 2016 election, and that is really all that's on his mind, and escaping the mention of his name in the Epstein files. And so it's much less sustained and much more ad hoc and episodic. It's fought out in the op-ed pages of newspapers and online, but not at the national level.
From the Israeli perspective, I think that there is, and you see it in every poll, right? More than 70% of Israelis want the war to end and the hostages to come back. I wonder, though, sort of continuing your thought about President Trump, is he someone that in his even inclination would be to say at some point to Netanyahu, stop the war, period?
Yeah, Yonit, I think he goes in and out. I generally, to give him his due, I think Trump really wants the war to end. He said that. He wants to see the killing end. He doesn't like the pictures. But in terms of, and he sent his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to try to get another hostage deal. So the U.S. is behind it. But that visceral sense of humanitarian urgency, I would say that's missing from this administration. It's more, hey, this is another problem. I'm tired of it. Could we fix it? Without a kind of larger vision of what would come next.
I'm interested to know whether one element in this is the kind of band of brothers bond between Trump and Netanyahu that may have followed their joint success, as they would certainly see it, in the confrontation with Iran in June, and whether now he feels much less inclined to get into a clash with his buddy, his kind of war buddy, and whether he feels, unusual word to use about Donald Trump, somehow loyal to Netanyahu, even beholden to him in some way. Is there some sense that he is just reluctant to issue the kind of directive to Netanyahu that we know he did in the Iran case when he actually said, essentially turned the bombers back? Is there some of that you're picking up, that he doesn't want to sort of muddy his success, again, as he sees it in Iran?
Very interesting question, Johnny. And what I would say is I'm torn in my answer. The terms personal loyalty and Donald Trump, anyone who's bet on those two words in their relationship with the president has discovered it's a bad bet. That said, Netanyahu and Trump met for a long time on Netanyahu's recent trip to Washington. And no one really, it was four eyes as best we can tell, and no one really knows what was said, and nothing really came out of it. My guess is a lot of what Netanyahu did was literally talk to Trump politician to politician and simply say, I'm your best Israeli partner, and these are my political constraints. And so somewhere I would guess they're lodged in the back of Trump's head right now. And then at the same time, he has his own constraints, his own aspirations for Nobel Prizes and greatness. And I think those two things are now conflicting in his head for the reasons you raised.
When Israelis, I think in general, look at the American reaction to them, and it's not only President Trump, obviously, it's the entire population. What we've been seeing recently, not only obviously rising criticism from the left, that has been the case for a long time, but also suddenly crowds, maybe not so suddenly, the MAGA crowd, criticizing Israel heavily, whether it be, the Tucker Carlson, the Steve Bannons, even the Matt Gaetz. How concerned should Israelis be from that specific phenomenon?
I think they should be very concerned, Yonit. There's this place where the far left and the far right meet for very different reasons, but the meeting ground is hostility toward Israel, more foreign aid to Israel, any kind of blank checks for Israel. And so they're still both minority phenomena, but it's really beginning to infect the center. And from 30,000 feet, what I see is a trend line that's going to end in a place that we've never seen before. It's a world that I never knew growing up, but it's a world my grandchildren will know growing up. A world in which my grandchildren will learn what it is to be Jewish in a world where the Jewish state is a pariah state. I never imagined such a scenario. But I think that's where all of this is heading without a real change in direction and leadership in Israel. A world where my grandchildren will know what it is to be Jewish when the Jewish state is not a source of pride, but actually a pariah. And you see the signs everywhere on college campuses. Groups like the American Teachers Association, that's not their name, I forgot what it, but they represent, saying, it was a large segment of them rejecting ADL literature on how to speak about Israel and anti-Semitism. These are signs of real hostility toward Israel, delegitimization of Israel, infecting the center now. And at the generational level, it's really profound in terms of young people and how they think. That to defend Israel now, openly, publicly, aggressively on a college campus or in a high school classroom, is to invite real isolation and real personal delegitimation.
Obviously, for an Israeli, it's a very difficult thing to hear. And, it's not only your grandchildren or Jonathan's children, it's my children. Growing up in that kind of world is just a terrible thought. And we can go into why this happened and it isn't fair and all that, but that is not the point. The question I just wanted to ask you is how do we stop that? Like, how do we? It's still preventable, isn't it?
Absolutely preventable. Let me sort of start at 30,000 feet. As I look at Israeli politics today and what's playing out, it's never been more starkly apparent to me that you've got a real struggle between, I would say, Zionist Israel, those who believe in the right, necessity, and viability of a Jewish democratic state in the land of Israel, at peace with its neighbors, with agreed borders. Messianic Israel, that believes in controlling all the land, no matter what the geopolitical or local consequences. And ultra-Orthodox Israel, that only sees the state as a source of resources to fund what is now a quarter of the Israeli population in schools that don't teach math, science, English, the skills really of modern life. And, I was thinking about it in preparation for our conversation that 2026 is going to be a really important year, for Israel and America. Our midterm election and Israel's next, most likely, national election. And as you know, I see Israel vis-a-vis America as off-Broadway versus Broadway. So trends that start off-Broadway tend to come our way, and trends on Broadway tend to come your way. But, Netanyahu and Trump are brothers from different mothers. And their parties are very much the same. Each is engaged in a project of basically authoritarian, electoral authoritarianism. That's where they're headed. You can see it with Netanyahu in terms of the fight with the Supreme Court and the effort to get rid of the Attorney General. And Trump basically is already there and now has his people installed in our Shin Bet, in our legal system. So they're both on the same track. And 2026 may be the last year that if Trump can win the House in 2026, if we have 4 years of this, boy, I just not sure what's going to be left, frankly. And if Israel has another 2 years or 4 years or, God forbid, 6 years of this, where basically Messianic Israel and ultra-Orthodox Israel shift so many resources and so much political legitimation to their, what to me are anti-Zionist projects, it's just really hard to see how we recover from that in ways we have in the past. So this is a really important moment. And to your question specifically, Yoni, I do think it's time for Zionist Israel to get off the Iraq lo Bibi, anyone but Bibi, and back to a Zionist vision of a Jewish democratic state at peace with its neighbors. Now, I realize, I'm someone who has always advocated for 2 states, even on October 8th, because my view is that the alternative is not 1 state, it's not 3 states. The alternative is actually no states for 2 people. The alternative is a grinding, permanent war with more and more powerful weapons going forward. So I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if there's a Palestinian partner for it. But I do know it should be the top priority of a Zionist party. Now, having said that, let me say that I do believe if we're going back to the 2-state idea after this, God willing, when the hostages are released, when the war in Gaza truly ends, we can't go from here to there anymore in one leap. I think we need a 2-stage, think of the peace process as 2 stages. Stage 1 has to be what I call Palestinian institution building for Israeli restraint. It's where Israel basically says to Palestinians, we've talked about this forever, you need to get a different Palestinian Authority, you need to get a different leadership, but we're at this time going to give you the political space to do that, the encouragement and the help, just the opposite of what Netanyahu has done. He sought at every turn to delegitimize the PA and to build up Hamas covertly. So that's number 1. And in return for that, you'll see restraint on Israeli settlements to give space for the political transformation among the PA, and that it will have legitimacy, that it can show the people that it's actually achieved something. I think we need that kind of pre-peace process before we can get to back to a peace process. I recognize the Gaza war, the Hamas attack on October 7th, this despicable act, and the violence that came from that is something Israelis are not going to get over, not for a year or 2 or whatever. So we need to institutionalize the foundations of a peace process.
So long-time listeners will know that I agree with huge amounts of what you've just said. And I too have been somebody, advocating 2-state solution for a long, long time. The response that comes back to me is after October 7th, good luck with that. There aren't takers for it in Israel. People, even who were once minded to embrace that as a vision, no longer believe it's credible. You can't do this with the people who are capable of a heinous atrocity like October the 7th. That's on the one hand. Then on the other side, what you hear is, well, there may have once been Palestinian takers for that, but the degree of anger and rage and grief that is left by the devastation that has happened those last 21 months mean they too are not in this game. And they say to people like us, Tom, find a new product, because that one has been roundly rejected in the post-October 7 era by both sides. Now, I want to believe everything you've said, and I think there'll be lots of listeners who feel the same way. How do you respond to that and say, despite the anger and heartache and grief and pain on both sides, this is still a message that can be sold?
It's a very important question, Johnny. And I would say two things. One is that until the hostages are released and back with their families in Israel and the war in Gaza is over, I don't think either of us having this conversation is realistic, because we just don't know. I do believe, and this is on the basis of history, and I'm interested in Yonit's reaction to this as well. That, you said I'm an old guy. I've been covering this story as a journalist since 1978. I covered the Iran-Iraq War from Kermanshah. I'm old. And I have seen, tragically, these people do terrible things to one another. Terrible, terrible things. And after each one, I've heard, Zeu, Gamarnu, no peace, no nothing, Zeu, can't have. Who can live with these people? Okay. I've heard that before. And at the end, including after the Second Intifada, which was terrible, the suicide, think of the war of the suicide bombing, that period where people couldn't get on buses, where, one of my closest friends lost his son, you know what I mean? And yet the morning breaks, the fruit sellers come out, and then people realize, Ein Brera, there's got to be a different way for here. And so that's really what I'm counting on. I think that there's Israeli politics before the hostages are released and after they're released. And the reason I'm confident about that, Johnny, is that the man I look to as the expert on Israeli politics, he's a guy called Bibi Netanyahu, knows that the best, which is why he never wants the hostages released. Something in Netanyahu's back of his mind says, there's a red line there, and there's trouble for me after this is over. And so I'm hoping for that. I'm counting on that. And again, I will be encouraging Trump, because he's the only president I have right now, to be dusting off the Trump peace plan for 2 states for 2 people, not as an end game, but as a starting point for negotiations. And so I just don't buy it. And the other reason I don't buy it, the new thing here, is that if you'll allow me to really dream the impossible dream, where I sit today, I see actually the most incredible opportunity for Israel since I've been covering this conflict. First of all, let's remember, there are 3 people in this marriage, okay? There's Israel and the Palestinians and that whole conflict. But there's also Israel and Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. This is the core of the real Arab consciousness. These 3 capitals, Beirut, Damascus, and Baghdad. In all 3 cities now, you have leaders who are ready to make peace with Israel, not to mention in Saudi Arabia. So if Israel actually began a legitimate process of 2 states for 2 people, you could actually end this conflict, okay? You could actually have peace between Israel and the entire Arab world. And so you're both so right. I know how hard this is. But if I'm an Israeli politician, that's how I'm going to frame this. You know what I mean? That we're at a moment where, by the way, credit where credit's due, that Israel's defeat of Hezbollah and the Iran threat network, directed by Netanyahu, was, in my view, the equivalent, and I wrote this before all of this, this was the 6-day war. It's had a profound effect, on the Arab world and the geopolitics in the region. Unfortunately, Netanyahu, and this is what I would be running on, Netanyahu can't accept Netanyahu's own plan. Netanyahu cannot reap what he sowed. He can't harvest the political benefits of the military victory that we have won, because only if you have a Palestinian partner will that happen. And that Palestinian partner now can unlock not only peace between Israelis and Palestinians, I believe, but actually end the conflict. And that's how I'd be framing it. I would, Donald Rumsfeld famously said, if you have a problem you can't solve, enlarge it. Well, that's what I would be doing here. I would be enlarging it, enlarge the aperture for people, and let Israelis understand why this is so important. Because, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, on one track, going down this track is really a track of delegitimation, where all of our kids and grandkids are going to grow up in a world that Tom and Yonit and Johnny never knew. Down one track. Down the other track is a path of real acceptance for the Zionist project, Zionist, Jewish democratic state in the land of Israel, at peace with its neighbor. And so I believe the logic of that is so powerful that at some point, someone's going to rise up in Israel and articulate it. And I'm also counting on, I've met a whole group of Israelis I'd never met before in the last 2 years through the democratic protest movement against the judicial coup, and now through the war. I do believe there's a young generation. Some of them are techies who thought, hey, we're just going to make money, we'll leave the politics to somebody else. I do believe there is a new generation waiting to bud into politics. It's going to take a while. It's not there overnight. And so, look, I am the eternal optimist, and somebody's got to be. And I may have told this story to you guys before, but I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, I was in Israel for a visit, and the editor of Haaretz had me over to his house and for dinner, and Haaretz runs my column in Hebrew, and that's like really important to me because it makes me, in some degree, a local columnist. And I said to him, "Why do you run my column?" And he said, "Tom, you're the only optimist we have." And there was an Israeli general there. He was Uzi Dayan, and he said to me, "Tom, I know why you're an optimist." I said, "Why?" He says, "Because you're short." I said, "Short? I'm not that short." He said, "Yeah, you can only see the part of the glass that's half full." So I am not that short, but I will continue to advocate this line because the alternative, and it's a very easy argument for me to make, is Asma. Asma. Tell me why this is going to end in a good way for Israel or the Jewish people, let alone for Palestinians who also deserve, a state of their own, a different outcome at peace with Israel. So I'm not deterred at all by this, and whatever, I may not be in Bibi's head, but I can assure you, he is not in my head.
You said that 2026 is going to be a crucial election year, both for the United States with the midterms and with Israel, whenever it will happen, but there will be elections in 2026. I want to ask something about the connection between the two. And I wonder whether, for instance, you think that the war in Gaza affected the rise of Zoran Mamdani. Would he be in a different position if this had not been the case at all?
It's a good question. You need to ask if you're an Israeli, because this is your world,
which
and
I
whatnot.
happen to be.
Yeah, exactly.
You think you're insinuating very politely that I'm self-involved.
No,
just
just
slightly, just a bit.
That's your perspective. And that all I'm saying is that I believe the real thing driving Mamdani is rent prices in New York City. And the whole affordability question, that if you're a policeman, a fireman, a school teacher in New York City, and in so many, frankly, blue Democratic run cities in America, you can't afford to live in the city you worked in. And so many young people now in New York City, they're pairing up, tripling up to afford apartments. So this whole affordability issue, I think, is the key thing. But the Gaza war certainly is part of saying we're into a different politics now. Look, the meta story behind all of this in America is that three things sort of converge in the last few years. One is that people stopped going to church and instead they went to Fox TV. That is, politics replaced religion, okay? At the same time, people stopped reading the New York Times and instead started reading influencers. So we went from church to Fox, from the New York Times to influencers. And at the same time, we have this we may be at peak employment. I'm not talking about unemployment. I'm talking about peak employment, that with AI coming down the road. And you have a generation that only knew COVID, and then Trump, and now this affordability problem. And so it's really radicalized our politics. And what I've tried to say to Mamdani, I don't know him, I wrote a short column about this, is that, and to the left in general, which is that if you have a mantra on this issue, whether it's from the river to the sea or globalize the intifada, and it takes you 15 minutes to explain why your mantra doesn't mean what it obviously means, you should get a different mantra. Let me suggest one for you. 2 states for 2 people. It works really well with drums, by the way. 2 states for 2 people. 2 states for 2 people. How is it that the left landed on a position on this issue that is contrary to the PLO's position? The PLO's position, the official legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, is 2 states for 2 people. And you guys are onto some crazy, far left idea. So what my contribution has tried to be is bring them back to reality to some degree. So, but what I've told, a friend of mine came up to the other day and simply said, "What are we going to do about Mamdani?" And this person meant it in the Israeli sense, and I said, "Look, I don't know, what we're going to do, but all I know is we better take this as a real warning sign, because a Muslim is very likely, Muslim American, going to be the next mayor of New York City, and for reasons that are partially fed by his stand on Israel, and against this Israeli government." And so I think people need to take that very, very seriously.
Well, that allows us perhaps to close our conversation, circling back to where we began, because your opening answer to us suggested that there was actually a difference between the discourse here in Europe, where it was, full spectrum opposition to where Israel is and what Israel is currently doing. And you drew a distinction and said in the US it wasn't quite like that yet. It was in high schools and campuses, but not. Do you, when you spoke to us earlier and sketched this future, avoidable future, but a future in which Israel is a pariah, you were assuming there that isolation that is currently experienced in Europe will spread, and that sentiment will become the American sentiment. So just to close out that thought, is that your expectation, that currently it's not there, but that it will go there absent some kind of change in direction?
Absolutely, Johnny. It's now in the water. Taboos have been broken. The man running for mayor of New York City is running on a platform to the left of 2 states, if you actually really pressed him, and so it's very clear to me, with what is going on the far right, the willingness of people like Tucker Carlson to advance, to platform anti-Semites, forget anti-Zionists, and on the far left to adopt positions to the left of the PLO. These are things that we've never seen here before. And, right now, because the political leadership of a different generation, Trump and Schumer, people like that, these are thoughts that are anathema to them. But if you look at what's going on just below them, the AOCs, and where where their political energy is and where they feel politically exposed, it's on this issue. And that's why I would end where I began, which is that we need parties and politicians in America and Israel ready to advance, defend, and support Zionist Israel. the Zionist notion, which is perfectly legitimate in my view, of the need, desire, and benefits of a Jewish democratic state in the land of Israel, in partnership and living in peace with a Palestinian state next to it. That is the only way forward, and we should not be intimidated by people in that, and we should not be afraid to say that, and we should also not hesitate to get in the face of the people who are opposing it and saying, where are you leading us? Where are you leading us? You, Netanyahu, you're leading us to an anti-democratic Israel? You, Smotrich, to an Israel that's permanently entangled with the Palestinians, and they can never be disentangled? So we have a permanent shepherd's war between us? And therefore you, who are absolutely making it impossible to take advantage of this incredible moment in history when Israel could be at peace with Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the entire Arab Muslim world? You, shame on you. So it's time for the center and the center left and the center right to get their act together, get off your butt and get Bibi out of your head and get your head into Bibi's.
Tom, I noticed that when Jonathan mentioned Europe, you didn't say he was self-involved. But when I talk about Israel, I'm kidding. Just noted, just to note. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you, Tom. I mean, even when the content is complicated and complex. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Anytime, you guys. You're the best.
That notion of his that he ends up being the most optimistic voice around when it comes to talking about Israel and the Middle East. It's a very hard job that he does there, but he does do it. And speaking with him, it's always illuminating, but there is always that little glimmer of hope. And his point that the Israeli left, or the anti-Bibi forces, have now got quite a product to sell. They could be saying, look, on the table is peace with the key players in the region. If only you were to grab it. That's quite a good pitch for the sort of anti-Bibi camp. And he's right that in a way that isn't the case that is made, because all the space is taken up, all the oxygen is sucked up by Netanyahu, who is such an enormous figure.
Yes, I think another interesting thing he talked about is Zoran Mamdani and what he thinks of him, and saying that he is even left of the PLO in the way that he defines what should be the solution in between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It was a really fascinating conversation, but I will want to tap into that warning of his about Israel being a pariah state. We saw something very interesting this week that I think we should mention, and that is the YouTubers, called the Full Send podcast. It's a popular podcast. These two guys, Kyle and Aaron. How shall we say this?
Not a weekly listener to you, to this show, Yonit? Something gives me the sense you're
Every fortnight. They're sort of kind of, I don't want to, I hope this analogy is okay, but they're kind of the Beavis and the Butthead of the podcast world. I mean, in the sense that they self-admittedly don't know a lot about foreign policy, and we're sort of really excited to land this interview with the Prime Minister, who would give obviously any podcast in English an interview before giving it to a mainstream Israeli network. So what happened in this interview? It was a pretty lightweight conversation. You know, he was asked about his favorite pizza and his favorite burger, and but what was interesting is really what happened after, when they opened up to see the responses to this interview and got really a hailstorm of criticism for bringing in Netanyahu, and not only from leftists, because this is more a MAGA-leaning podcast, but rather from that kind of crowd, the right-leaning crowd, the far-right-leaning crowd, and that is really, I think, concerning. The way that they relate, and they used some of the people in the responses said, this is a Hitler-like figure. So that is the criticism of the Prime Minister, and that is how he's viewed by, this bubble of people who listen to the podcast. But still, it's something, again, I would just say, this is a Prime Minister who for a very long time is not giving interviews to mainstream Israeli television networks, and somehow thought this would be a better idea.
Yeah, and the larger strategic play that he has made over a long period, decade or more, has been that the American right is the place for Israel and pro-Israel forces to pitch their tent. For decades, it was about the Democrats and sort of liberal New York and all of that. And he decided, no, there is the richer terrain, more fertile terrain for Israel would be evangelicals and the American right and the far right even. That's going to be that's where he placed his bet. And look at how that's worked out. There were those of us who said these are not people who really like Jews, for one thing. When you're talking about the kind of people that Tucker Carlson is platforming, who are revisionist historians saying that Hitler, has been badly misjudged and so on. These are not your friends, these people. And sure enough, as Tom Friedman made that point, there is now a horseshoe of far left and far right criticism of Israel that uses identical language. I think we talked on the podcast the other day about Matt Gaetz, who, you just have to change one or two words. He talks about Judea and Samaria rather than West Bank. Edit out those bits. The rest could be coming out of Team Mamdani. They are mirroring each other now. It goes to this point that particularly with the young, whether they are on the right or on the left, there is a similar refrain of deep hostility to Israel. And Netanyahu, I think, has time to reflect on the play he made. He's pitched his tent in some very, very unreliable, dodgy ground.
I think you're missing an opportunity here, Mr. Friedland, because we're a podcast and we're in English and we're willing to be idiots like the Nelk boys. And so I think that, the Prime Minister could come on this program, because obviously not going to come on Channel 12 News. So
but he should come on here and we will do our Beavis and Butthead impersonation for him. That's how ready we are. No.
I'm calling Beavis.
Okay. No, I'm not in a huge hurry for that interview. I just don't think we yet fit the bill of the kind of places he wants to speak. What a massive insult to the people of Israel, really, being serious for one moment, that he talks to these guys and won't talk directly to Israelis or on any of the other mainstream outlets. He could in Israel. Just add that to the rap sheet. Should we hand out some awards, Yonit?
I think so.
Oh, before we do, if you're looking for things to watch on YouTube, you don't have to watch the Beavis and Butthead guys. We are there, this podcast, including the interview you just heard with Tom Friedman, but a whole lot of other interviews we've done. You can see them there going back, including Ilana Diane, who was brilliant last week. So they are all there. Awards for Chutzpah. I thought we might nominate. It feels as if we've had a sort of couple in this zone, but long-time listeners will know of our shared affection for the genre of musical theatre. There's a new cast for Cabaret on Broadway, same production that got rave reviews here. The actor and singer Billy Porter was giving an interview promoting his new role in this new production of Cabaret, where he stated that black people have replaced the Jews. The context of this is that the three lead parts of the show are for the first time to be played by African American performers. And he said, and with what's going on in the world right now, black people have replaced the Jews in this sort of configuration of what we're going through. I take that to mean the people who now are going through the tough kind of persecution and racism that is depicted in Cabaret are now black people rather than Jews. Lots of criticism has obviously come his way. This is an old line, this idea that, anti-Semitism is a historic phenomenon from the past, that other minorities are now the new Jews. That argument falls apart when you consider that anti-Semitism is very much in the present. You just look at the statistics in the United States, across the world, where anti-Semitic attacks are very high. They have been particularly in the last 20, 21 months. There is nothing past tense about it, and you don't need to say that. You could just say black people and Jewish people have this history in common, for example, of racist persecution. It's not a competition. You don't have to edge aside one group in order to empathize with another. So a Chutzpah award to the incoming star of Cabaret, Billy Porter, for those rather ill-chosen words.
Mensch Award of the week, I think needs to, and this connects a little bit to the conversation we were having earlier, I would give it to a woman named Shvut Ra'anan, who's very well-known in Israel already, less so outside Israel. She is one of the founders of an organization called the Reservists Hamiluimnikim. And she's of the religious Zionism. She has 5 children. Everywhere she shows up with a small baby girl. And she is fighting for, against the exemption bill and giving an exemption to the ultra-Orthodox. You see her in all these meetings. And obviously coming from, you would assume, from the right side of the political map and not the left side. But she is fighting against this bill and saying everywhere and to all of the politicians that she can, our families that are taking on this burden, the part of society that is doing reserve duty in hundreds of days, cannot continue to hold on to this burden without the other part of the population, the ultra-Orthodox, also holding their share. And I think this is, again, the group to notice, the religious Zionists and their argument and their fight for their battle for this sort of equal service in the military. I think if anywhere a change will be made that will come from that point. She's a very impressive woman. She's also a lawyer. I don't know how she managed to do all that while having 5 kids, but that is the case, and I think that she deserves the Mensch Award.
So we have wrapped up our award winners for another week. We mention again that we are available on multiple platforms, including YouTube, and we do have some thank yous, Yonit.
Indeed. A big thank you to Michal Porat this week, like every week. As we said, our special deep dive into the disengagement from Gaza as our bonus episode this week, and lots to come next week as well.